The silver screen blazed with dramatic images as Hollywood portrayed the Battle of Midway as a perfectly choreographed American triumph, complete with heroic pilots delivering stirring speeches before diving into battle against overwhelming odds. Yet the truth behind June 4th through 7th, 1942, reveals a far more complex and fascinating story than any movie could capture. One where blind luck, tragic miscommunication, and split-second decisions shaped the outcome of the Pacific War more than strategic brilliance or superior American technology. Popular mythology has transformed Midway into a tale of David versus Goliath, where plucky American underdogs used superior tactics and technology to defeat a massive Japanese armada. The reality was far messier and more terrifying for the participants. Admiral Chester Nimitz didn't possess some mystical strategic genius that guaranteed victory. Instead, he made a series of calculated gambles based on fragmented intelligence, any one of which could have resulted in the complete destruction of America's remaining Pacific carrier force. The most persistent myth surrounding Midway centers on the supposed perfection of American code-breaking capabilities. Popular accounts suggest that Commander Joseph Rochefort's cryptanalysts at Station Hypo had completely penetrated Japanese naval communications, providing Nimitz with detailed knowledge of enemy plans. The truth was more precarious. American codebreakers had managed to crack only about 40% of the Japanese naval code JN-25, leaving enormous gaps in their understanding of Japanese intentions and capabilities. The famous AF is Midway deception, where American intelligence officers tricked the Japanese into confirming Midway as their target by sending a fake message about the island's water supply problems, has been elevated to legendary status in popular accounts. While this operation did occur, it represented just one piece of a much larger intelligence puzzle that remained frustratingly incomplete right up until the battle began. Nimitz was operating on educated guesswork rather than certain knowledge when he positioned his carriers northeast of Midway. Another enduring fiction portrays the Japanese as overconfident fools who walked blindly into an American trap. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, was actually an extremely cautious planner who had designed the Midway operation with multiple contingencies and backup plans. His strategy included a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands, complex timing designed to catch American forces off guard, and overwhelming numerical superiority in every category of warship. The Japanese weren't arrogant, they were following a logical plan that should have succeeded. The myth of American technological superiority also crumbles under examination. Japanese Zero fighters remained superior to American Wildcats in most performance categories. Japanese torpedoes were far more reliable than their American counterparts, and Japanese pilots generally possessed more combat experience than their American opponents. The Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers that would suffer such horrific casualties were already obsolete by 1942 standards, lumbering death traps that had no business facing modern fighters and anti-aircraft defenses. Documented in Craig Simmons' comprehensive analysis, The Battle of Midway, the American victory resulted from a combination of tactical luck, Japanese mistakes, and extraordinary individual courage rather than any systematic advantage in planning or equipment. Perhaps the most dangerous myth about Midway suggests that American victory was somehow inevitable once the codebreakers discovered Japanese plans. This interpretation ignores the dozens of critical moments where different decisions or slightly altered timing could have produced a catastrophic American defeat. The battle balanced on knife-edge margins that left no room for error or overconfidence. The real story of Midway reveals something far more inspiring than Hollywood heroics. It shows how ordinary men facing impossible odds can achieve extraordinary results through courage, sacrifice, and occasional incredible luck. The romantic image of American codebreakers sitting in underground chambers, perfectly deciphering every Japanese message with mathematical precision, has dominated popular understanding of the Battle of Midway for over 8 decades. The reality of Station Hypo's intelligence operation was far more chaotic, uncertain, and desperately improvised than the smooth-running intelligence machine portrayed in books and films. Commander Joseph Rochefort's basement team at Pearl Harbor worked around the clock in a windowless concrete bunker, surviving on coffee, cigarettes, and determination while struggling with fragments of intercepted Japanese transmissions. The Japanese naval code JN-25 had over 50,000 possible cipher combinations, and American cryptanalysts had successfully identified perhaps 20,000 of them by June 1942. This partial success left enormous gaps in their understanding. Entire sections of Japanese messages remained incomprehensible, forcing analysts to guess at crucial details. The famous breakthrough that identified AF as Midway involved considerably more uncertainty than popular accounts suggest. When Japanese messages repeatedly referenced an upcoming operation against AF, Rochefort's team faced dozens of possible targets throughout the Pacific. The water shortage deception that supposedly confirmed Midway as the target was actually just one of several intelligence indicators, and some senior Navy officials remained skeptical about the identification right up until Japanese aircraft appeared over Midway itself. More critically, American intelligence failed to detect several crucial elements of Japanese planning. The diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands caught American forces completely by surprise, suggesting that Japanese operational security was far more effective than later accounts acknowledged. Rochefort's team also significantly underestimated the size of the Japanese force heading for Midway. They identified 4 aircraft carriers, when intelligence reports suggested the possibility of additional carriers beyond the main striking force. The timing of the Japanese attack presented another intelligence challenge that has been glossed over in popular histories. While American codebreakers correctly predicted that the attack would occur in early June, they couldn't pin down the exact date until just days before the battle. This uncertainty forced Nimitz to keep his carriers on station for several days, burning precious fuel and wearing down his aircrew through constant readiness alerts that might have proven disastrous if the battle had been delayed by weather or Japanese operational changes. Perhaps most importantly, American intelligence provided almost no tactical information about Japanese carrier operations, aircraft capabilities, or defensive procedures. Nimitz knew where the Japanese fleet would be and approximately when they would attack, but he had no detailed information about their formations, combat air patrol patterns, or vulnerability windows that could help his pilots achieve successful attacks. American aviators would discover these crucial tactical details only through deadly trial and error during the battle itself. The intelligence picture also contained significant false information that could have led to disaster. Japanese deception. Operations convinced some American analysts that additional enemy carriers might be operating in other areas of the Pacific, potentially threatening the West Coast while American forces were committed to defending Midway. These phantom threats forced Nimitz to hold back some of his limited resources rather than committing everything to the Central Pacific battle. Station Hypo's greatest achievement wasn't perfect intelligence gathering, but rather providing just enough information to allow Nimitz to position his forces for an ambush. The codebreakers gave American commanders a crucial advantage, but victory still required individual pilots to find the Japanese fleet across hundreds of square miles of empty ocean, coordinate their attacks without reliable communications, and execute precision bombing runs under intense enemy fire. The myth of omniscient American intelligence has obscured the far more inspiring truth that victory at Midway resulted from making the best possible decisions with incomplete information, under impossible time pressure. Hollywood's favorite narrative casts the Battle of Midway as a classic David versus Goliath confrontation, with a small American force heroically defeating a massive Japanese armada through superior courage and determination. This compelling story contains enough truth to seem plausible, while hiding the more complex reality of how naval power actually functioned in the Pacific War of 1942. The numerical comparison that creates the David and Goliath impression focuses exclusively on total ship counts, where the Japanese combined fleet indeed assembled an imposing array of vessels for the Midway operation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's force included 11 battleships, 8 cruisers, over 40 destroyers, and supporting vessels that created an impressive display of naval might spread across thousands of square miles of Pacific Ocean. American newsreels and post-war accounts seized on these numbers to emphasize the seemingly impossible odds faced by Admiral Chester Nimitz's defenders. However, this numerical comparison obscures the tactical reality of carrier warfare, where only aircraft-carrying vessels could effectively engage enemy forces beyond visual range. The Japanese brought 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carrying approximately 270 aircraft, while the Americans deployed 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, with roughly 230 aircraft. The actual balance of striking power was much closer than the overall ship count suggested. More importantly, the presence of Japanese battleships and cruisers represented both strength and weakness in the context of carrier operations. These powerful surface vessels required enormous amounts of fuel, limiting the fleet's operational range and forcing complex logistics operations that made the entire force less maneuverable. The Americans, operating closer to their Pearl Harbor base with simpler logistics requirements, actually possessed greater operational flexibility despite their smaller overall force. The myth of American technological inferiority also requires careful examination. While Japanese Zero fighters did outperform American Wildcats in speed and maneuverability, American aircraft possessed advantages in durability and firepower that would prove crucial during the actual combat. Japanese aircraft were built for maximum performance at minimum weight, making them vulnerable to battle damage that American planes could survive. The Douglas Dauntless dive bomber, derided as obsolete by some historians, actually represented one of the most effective naval attack aircraft of the early war period. American pilot training, while less extensive than the lengthy programs that produced experienced Japanese aviators, emphasized different skills that proved valuable at Midway. Japanese pilots excelled at individual combat techniques and formation flying, but American training focused more heavily on navigation, communication, and coordinated attack procedures. These differences would become critical when scattered. American attack groups had to locate the Japanese fleet and coordinate their assaults without central control. The industrial capacity comparison that underlies the David and Goliath narrative also misrepresents the strategic situation in June 1942. While American shipyards and aircraft factories would eventually outproduce their Japanese counterparts by enormous margins, this industrial advantage had not yet manifested in deployed naval strength. The 3 American carriers at Midway represented virtually the entire operational strength of the Pacific Fleet, making the battle far more of an even match than post-war industrial statistics might suggest. As detailed in John Lundstrom's authoritative study, The First Team, the actual force balance at Midway was much more even than popular accounts suggest, with both sides operating near the limits of their available strength. The geographic factors that influence the battle also complicate the simple David versus Goliath narrative. The Japanese were operating over 3,000 miles from their main bases, while American forces fought within range of land-based aircraft from Midway itself. This geographic advantage partially offset Japanese numerical superiority and provided American commanders with additional tactical options unavailable to their opponents. The real miracle of Midway wasn't that a tiny American force defeated a massive Japanese armada, but rather that 2 relatively evenly matched naval forces fought a battle where split-second timing and individual courage determined the outcome. The popular image of American victory at Midway depicts a perfectly coordinated assault where dive, bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters worked together in seamless harmony to overwhelm Japanese defenses through superior teamwork and tactical planning. This stirring narrative of American military efficiency bears almost no resemblance to the chaotic, uncoordinated, and frequently disastrous reality of how the decisive attacks actually unfolded on June 4, 1942. The truth about American coordination begins with the complete breakdown of the planned attack formation almost immediately after launch. Enterprise and Hornet launched their strike groups at different times with different target coordinates, while Yorktown's aircraft departed an hour later with yet another set of assumptions about Japanese fleet positions. The 3 carrier air groups had no way to communicate with each other once airborne, essentially creating 3 separate and uncoordinated attacks against the same target. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's decision to lead Torpedo Squadron 8 away from the planned intercept course represented the kind of individual initiative that contradicted all military doctrine about coordinated operations. Waldron's intuition about Japanese fleet movements proved correct, but his deviation from orders meant that his 15 torpedo bombers arrived over the target completely alone, without fighter escort or dive bomber support. The result was the virtual annihilation of his entire squadron. The dive bomber attacks that ultimately crippled the Japanese fleet succeeded through a series of coincidences that no military planner could have arranged. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey found the Japanese carriers by following the wake of a single destroyer, while Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's squadrons from Yorktown arrived at almost exactly the same time through pure chance. The three squadrons attacked different carriers simultaneously, not because of superior coordination, but because each squadron commander made independent targeting decisions without any knowledge of what the other groups were doing. The fighter escort that was supposed to protect American attack aircraft never found their assigned bombers, leaving the strike groups to face Japanese defenses alone. Some Wildcat fighters spent the entire battle flying search patterns over empty ocean, never engaging enemy aircraft or providing any support to the bombers that desperately needed protection. Other fighter sections became separated from their charges during the long transit to the target area and were forced to return to their carriers without contributing to the battle. Communication failures plagued every aspect of the American attack. Radio equipment proved unreliable over the long distances involved, forcing squadron commanders to rely on hand signals and pre-arranged procedures that broke down as soon as combat began. Many pilots never received updates about changing tactical situations, flying into battle with outdated information about enemy positions and capabilities. The torpedo attacks that preceded the dive bomber assaults illustrate the tragic consequences of poor coordination. 3 separate torpedo squadrons attacked the Japanese fleet over a 30-minute period, each believing they were executing a coordinated plan, when in fact they were simply arriving piecemeal to be destroyed by concentrated Japanese defenses. The heroic sacrifice of these aircrew did draw Japanese fighters down to sea level, but this tactical advantage was achieved through coincidence rather than planning. Even the successful dive bomber attacks suffered from coordination problems that could have proven disastrous. Some bombers targeted the same carriers, while others went completely undefended, and several near collisions occurred as different squadrons dove through the same airspace without knowing about each other's presence. The fact that 3 Japanese carriers were sunk in 5 minutes resulted from individual pilot initiative and pure luck rather than coordinated tactical execution. As documented in Dallas Woodbury, Isom's detailed analysis, Midway Inquest, the American victory resulted from individual heroism and fortunate timing rather than superior coordination or tactical planning. The myth of perfect coordination has obscured the far more remarkable truth about Midway, that American aircrew achieved decisive victory despite operating in complete chaos, without reliable communications, and with virtually no coordination between different attack groups. Their success came from individual courage and determination, rather than systematic military efficiency. Perhaps no aspect of the Battle of Midway has been more dramatically oversimplified than the famous 5 minutes that changed the world narrative, which suggests that American dive bombers destroyed 3 Japanese aircraft carriers in a single, perfectly timed assault between 10:22 and 10:27 on the morning of June 4, 1942. While these 5 minutes were indeed crucial, the reality of what happened involves a much more complex sequence of events spread over several hours, with multiple attacks, near misses, and failed coordination attempts that complicate the neat Hollywood version of history. The 5 minutes story typically begins with Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise arriving over the Japanese fleet at precisely the moment when enemy carriers were most vulnerable, with flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. This dramatic timing was indeed fortunate, but it obscured the fact that McCluskey had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over 2 hours and was nearly forced to turn back due to fuel shortages when he spotted the destroyer Arashi's wake, leading him to the target. The coordinated nature of the attack has been greatly exaggerated in popular accounts. McCluskey's Enterprise bombers attacked simultaneously with Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown squadrons purely by coincidence. Neither commander knew the other was approaching the target, and they had taken completely different routes to reach the Japanese fleet. The perfect coordination that devastated 3 carriers in 5 minutes was actually a fortunate accident that no amount of planning could have guaranteed. The vulnerability of the Japanese carriers during those crucial minutes resulted from a complex series of decisions and circumstances that extended far beyond the immediate time frame. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo had ordered his reserve aircraft to be rearmed from ship attack to land attack ordnance for a second strike on Midway. Then, reversed this decision when reports arrived of American naval forces in the area. This created the dangerous situation where flight decks were cluttered with fuel lines, ammunition, and aircraft in various stages of preparation. However, the Japanese were not sitting ducks during the American attack. Zero fighters were climbing rapidly to intercept the diving bombers, and anti-aircraft fire from every ship in the fleet created a deadly barrier that claimed several American aircraft. The success of the dive bombing attacks required not just good timing, but also exceptional piloting skills and considerable luck to penetrate the Japanese defenses and achieve hits on fast-moving, maneuvering targets. The actual sequence of hits was more spread out than the 5 minutes narrative suggests. The first bombs to strike Akagi fell at 10:26, but the attacks on Kaga and Soryu continued for several more minutes as different sections of bombers made their individual runs. Some bombers missed their targets entirely and had to circle back for second attacks, while others scored near misses that contributed to the overall destruction without landing direct hits. The fires that ultimately destroyed the 3 carriers took hours to reach critical stages, despite popular images of ships exploding instantly upon being hit. Akagi burned for most of the day before her magazine finally exploded, while Kaga and Soryu remained afloat long enough for extensive damage control efforts and crew evacuation procedures. The instant destruction suggested by compressed historical accounts ignores the prolonged agony experienced by Japanese sailors fighting fires and flooding throughout the afternoon. More importantly, the focus on 5 decisive minutes ignores the crucial role played by the earlier torpedo attacks that had drawn Japanese fighter cover down to sea level and disrupted the enemy fleet's defensive formations. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 and other units created the conditions that made the dive bomber attacks possible. But these contributions are often minimized in favor of the more dramatic story of precision bombing. As detailed in Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully's revisionist account, Shattered Sword, the destruction of the Japanese carriers resulted from a complex chain of events rather than a single decisive moment. The myth of 5 decisive minutes has created unrealistic expectations about military operations and obscured the more complex reality of how naval battles actually develop over extended periods through the accumulation of individual actions, tactical decisions, and random factors that resist simple narrative compression. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Midway spawned a collection of myths about Japanese collapse and American invincibility that have persisted for over 8 decades, obscuring the more nuanced reality of how this pivotal engagement actually affected the broader course of the Pacific War. Popular accounts often suggest that Midway single-handedly crippled Japanese naval power and guaranteed eventual American victory, when the truth reveals a more complex strategic picture where both sides adapted to new circumstances and continued fighting with determination for 3 more years. The myth of instant Japanese naval collapse ignores the substantial remaining strength of the combined fleet after Midway. While the loss of 4 fleet carriers was indeed catastrophic, Japan still possessed light carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that continued to pose serious threats to American operations. The Japanese Navy fought major battles at Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf with considerable effectiveness, demonstrating that Midway had damaged but not destroyed Japanese naval capabilities. Popular narratives often claim that Japan lost her most experienced pilots at Midway, crippling future training programs and ensuring American air superiority. While pilot losses were significant, the majority of Japanese carrier aircrew survived the battle and continued flying combat missions for months afterward. The real pilot shortage developed gradually as the war progressed, and Japanese training programs failed to keep pace with operational losses across the entire Pacific theater. The strategic initiative supposedly gained by Americans at Midway has been overstated in many historical accounts. While the victory did enable the Guadalcanal campaign that began 2 months later, American forces remained on the strategic defensive for most of 1942 and 1943. The massive carrier construction program that would give America overwhelming superiority didn't reach full production until 1944, meaning that both sides operated with roughly comparable forces for nearly 2 years after Midway. Japanese industrial capacity, often portrayed as hopelessly outmatched after Midway, actually continued producing carriers, aircraft, and trained pilots throughout the war. The light carriers Junyo, Hio, and Ryuho joined the fleet in late 1942, while the large carrier Taiho and converted carriers Shinano represented continued Japanese efforts to rebuild their carrier strength. The industrial imbalance that eventually doomed Japan was a long-term factor rather than an immediate consequence of the Midway defeat. The psychological impact of Midway on Japanese leadership has been both exaggerated and misunderstood in popular accounts. While the defeat certainly shocked military planners who had expected easy victory, it did not fundamentally alter Japanese strategic thinking or lead to immediate peace overtures. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto continued planning offensive operations, including the ill-fated I-Go air offensive of 1943, demonstrating that Japanese leaders remained committed to achieving victory through military action. American overconfidence following Midway created its own set of problems that have been largely ignored in triumphant historical narratives. The assumption that Japanese resistance would quickly collapse led to inadequate preparation for subsequent campaigns and unrealistic timetables that prolonged the war. The bloody battles at Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima demonstrated that Japanese defensive capabilities remained formidable despite the carrier losses at Midway. The intelligence advantages that contributed to American victory at Midway also proved temporary as Japanese forces adapted their communication procedures and cipher systems. Station Haipyo's code-breaking success became less effective as the war progressed, forcing American commanders to rely more heavily on traditional intelligence-gathering methods and tactical innovation rather than the cryptographic advantages that had been so crucial in June 1942. As documented in Richard Frank's comprehensive analysis, Downfall, the Pacific War continued for 3 more years after Midway, with both sides demonstrating remarkable resilience and adaptability. The long-term consequences of Midway were indeed significant, but they developed gradually through the accumulation of industrial advantages, tactical innovations, and strategic decisions made over many months rather than through the immediate collapse of Japanese resistance. The battle marked a turning point, but victory required 3 more years of sustained effort across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean, culminating in the atomic bombings and Soviet entry into the war that finally forced Japanese surrender. Understanding these complexities doesn't diminish the importance of Midway, but rather places it in proper historical context as one crucial battle in a long and difficult war.